Kroc Institute or about some of your research, and we'll see how that goes. Okay?
Sure. Okay.
You are now live, and I get to introduce you. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Let's go to Indiana and Notre Dame University today, shall we? I want to talk to my friend David Courtwright, who is a very important person in the world of peace studies. He is the director of the Global Policy Initiative, and he's a professor emeritus of practice of peace activism, peace something or other, at the Kroc Institute, which is a wonderful outfit, probably one of the main places in the world where you could really study peace on an amazing scale at Notre Dame. So I've never been there, and that's going to give me a chance to kind of sniff around and see what those folks do that I've heard about so long. So good morning, David.
Good morning, Meta. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm in a very happy mood. This is going to be something I've looked forward to a long time. Let me tell you, as far as I know, you and I have met in person only once. And you would not remember it, but it's memorable to me because you really changed the course of my life. We met for lunch or sat at the same table by accident, I suppose, at a meeting in, I think, New York, way back in the 80s. And you said that you were writing a book about the success of the American peace movement in influencing US policy. And I thought, that's hard, because I couldn't see that the US peace movement or even the global peace movement had that at the same table by accident, I suppose, at a meeting in, I did something wrong, but I can edit it out, sorry. So I couldn't see that the world peace movement had had any influence on US policy at all at that moment in time. And I thought, well, you know what? We've had more influence on Russian or so at that time Soviet policy than we had on US policy. I feel I personally had some influence on Soviet policy by just simply going there, and I had a lot more, they paid more attention to me than my own government by far. And I think we really did have an impact. So at that moment, I thought, okay, you write your book about how the peace movement has been effective in the US. I'll write a book about how our peace movement has been more effective in the Soviet Union. And so I did. It took me another 20 years or so to write it, but I was doing the research by going there at least once a year for many, many years. So you didn't know probably that you were the inspiration for the book that I wrote called The Russian Quest for Peace and Democracy, right?
Right.
So I have to thank you for doing that. And let's go back and talk about your book. I don't remember the title of your book because, as you can imagine, I thought your book was going to be much less significant than mine because I thought we really didn't have much influence on U.S. policies. So tell me, do you still believe we did? And I know that you were the head of SANE, so you probably had more influence than most people, for sure, a lot more than I did. But nevertheless, you know, I think I was skeptical at the time. Tell me more about your opinion about that.
Sure. Well, thanks. I'm glad it had some influence and inspired your research. That's what we hope to do in peace studies and in our research, of course. The book is entitled Peace Works, The Citizen's Role in Ending the Cold War. And I wrote it, I think it was published in '93. And it was an attempt to really look at the whole process of the disarmament and anti-nuclear mobilizations that began to really intensify in the late 70s and then all through the 1980s in the US, in Europe, all over the world. Many disarmament movements evolved at that time, including the big rally that we had in New York's Central Park in June of 1982, when nearly 1 million people showed up to call for a freeze and reversal of the nuclear arms race.
I was
And,
one of them.
Yeah, I was on the organizing committee of that project along with Cora Weiss and Leslie Kagan and a number of other veteran peace activists. And at the time, I remember people saying, well, we had this gigantic rally, and the next day Reagan said, he wasn't paying attention, and the arms race continued. So it was all a waste of time. But I tried to look at the overall process cumulatively over the years and what was accomplished. And I think it's clear that a number of concrete results came about that helped to shift the political climate away from more armament, more nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union, towards arms control, arms reduction, and then laid the groundwork for the ending of the Cold War. So first of all, you can see that the Reagan administration, when it came in, was very strongly advocating for nuclear buildup. They said they would not negotiate with the Soviets until after they had completed their buildup. But in fact, within a year of coming into office, they were at the bargaining table.
Hold on, I want to interrupt because here's an interesting controversy. I did a talk show, an interview with Jack Matlock about a month ago.
Sure.
And I said just what you said, that Reagan had started off as a hawk and somehow sort of morphed into more of a dove. And that he still would never get credit for being as much the peacemaker as Gorbachev was, but that he, he had been changed. And I was asking Matlock whether he had anything to do with that change, transformation in Reagan. And he took issue with me and said that Reagan had always been pro-peace. And maybe in his heart of hearts, or maybe it was hidden, it wasn't quite clear why it looked like a big turnaround. But to me, it certainly did. And you just said that to you, it sure looked like a turnaround. At least US policy made a big switch. So do you have any thoughts about whether or not maybe it's true that Reagan had always been sort of a peace-loving guy and we just hadn't noticed?
Well, in his own fashion, you could say, yes. I mean, remember that he was a Democrat, and when he was at the Screen Actors Guild in the late 40s and 50s, he was among those who in those days were critiquing the arms race that was just starting at the time. But of course, he shifted to the hard right in US politics. But all during his career, you can look at statements and things that he said or wrote to his colleagues, that he was always very skeptical and fearful of nuclear weapons. He never really was comfortable with nuclear weapons, or at least so he claimed. But he did believe in this philosophy of peace through strength. And their whole approach in the administration was to build up nuclear weapons to a fearsome level, and that somehow the Soviets would cry uncle and give up, and then the arms race would be over and the US and the West would be triumphant. Now, the fact that the Soviet Union did kind of give up, under Gorbachev, in the sense of giving up its militarized nuclear kind of approach, doesn't mean that it was because of the buildup of our nuclear weapons and all of our military spending in the early 80s.
Although there are plenty of people who would say that is why it was,
Well, that's true, but if you can look at the statements of Yakovlev and a number of the key policymakers in the Soviet Union at the time, the ones who were actually making the decisions, said that for Gorbachev, and you probably know this as your scholarship, when they came into power in 84, 85 in the Soviet Union, they always had a reform agenda in mind. And as Yakovlev said at one point, we would have negotiated arms reductions sooner, but the Reagan people were not interested when we first began to approach them on this topic. And in terms of bankrupting the Soviet Union, well, the Soviet Union was, to an extent, bankrupted over the years, but that has to do more with the fundamental corruption of the system itself. And the yes, excessive arms spending, but they didn't diminish their arms spending during the 80s. They were spending a huge amount, and they actually had more nuclear weapons than we did. If you go to the peak of the insanity of the arms race around 86, 87, they kept right on building more and more nuclear weapons. They changed as a political decision. And the US and Reagan were willing to move in that direction because they were facing a tremendous amount of political pressure at home to moderate their nuclear buildup and to negotiate with the Soviet Union. And all the pressure that we were applying as activists out in the streets in Central Park and in Europe, there was those huge demonstrations in 81 and 83, some of the largest demonstrations in history prior to the big demonstrations that were opposed to the Iraq War in February of 2003. But in 81 and 83, there were equally large demonstrations in many European cities against the nuclear weapons buildup. And in those demonstrations, the demand was no to US nuclear weapons, but also no to Soviet nuclear weapons. And it was the idea of a double zero. They wanted to eliminate all of the theater nuclear weapons that were being deployed at that time and were creating a tremendous increase in the nuclear danger or the risk of nuclear war. And the Reagan administration adopted that idea as their negotiating posture when they went into the talks about the intermediate range missiles, the INF treaty negotiations. And they did so despite the cautionary words of many of the military advisors of the administration, and said, no, we don't want to give up our nukes. We want the Soviets to give up their nukes. But when they began to negotiate, that idea was on the table. And then Gorbachev came to the Geneva negotiations, and then at Reykjavik especially, and said, yeah, okay, we'll take the deal. Now they disagreed about missile defense issues and the like, and they didn't come to a full agreement at that time.
Well, just Star Wars, basically, wasn't it? Well, that's about right. The size of it, yeah.
And that's, we should talk about that, but just to stay with the Reykjavik story, they didn't agree at Reykjavik, but they did set the framework for negotiations. And those teams worked furiously then and in the weeks and months afterwards and came up with the treaty to eliminate all intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe. And initially there were many in the US that said, well, no, we don't want to take this deal. Kissinger and Nixon famously wrote an op-ed saying, no, this is a bad deal for us. But Reagan was willing to accept it, and there was a political climate that had been created through the worldwide disarmament movement that made it good politics for Reagan to accept the Soviet deal. So you can look at it at that level. You can also look at the way in which the whole nuclear freeze movement began to catch on very widely across the United States. It led to the development of an arms control caucus within the US Congress, very active, which put pressure on the administration. They actually threatened to withhold funds for some of their nuclear weapons unless the administration was willing to negotiate and be more flexible with the Soviet Union.
Hold on, this is the Congress that was threatening to do that?
Yeah, and there was legislation.
I can't remember what the balance of power was in Congress at that time. It must have been Democrats, although I wouldn't even say that Democrats were, much more peace-loving than the Republicans.
Yeah, most of the members of the Arms Control Caucus were Democrats, but they and it was bizarre and strange politics. The administration wanted to build the MX missile. We had a very effective lobby in the US to restrict and end some aspects of the MX missile program. And that went on for years. I was at the center of this big coalition to stop the MX missile. And part of what went on in Congress is the strange politics of Washington was the Congress would say, we're not going to fund any more missiles unless you go to the Geneva bargaining table, negotiating table, and reach an agreement with the Soviet Union to limit the arms buildup. So they would go back and forth, and the administration would change some of its positions. And in exchange, Congress would give a little bit more money for the missiles. And there were, 5 or 6 huge legislative battles over these issues where the Congress actually did cut off funding for the MX a couple of times. Other times they allowed it, but only after they got promises from the administration to be more flexible on arms control.
Okay.
But and there was also the fight over nuclear weapons testing. Here again, we battled in the U.S. Congress and were able to gain a majority in 87 and then 86, 87. And several times thereafter, Congress voted to cut off all funding for nuclear weapons testing in the United States. And that was one of the main gestures that Gorbachev made. Remember, on the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima, he announced, was it the 50th? My math is off here a little bit.
I don't remember
40th.
either, but
Maybe it's the 40th.
a moratorium on
whatever it was. Yeah, 50th. That they offered to halt and did halt all Soviet nuclear testing unilaterally and asked the US to respond. Of course, the US did not, but then Congress went to work to cut off the funding, and eventually the US did also completely end nuclear testing. So there's those kinds of ways in which specific measures were adopted to force the administration's hand. And more importantly is that there was a political climate that was created in the US and worldwide, demanding that political leaders show progress towards reducing the nuclear weapons threat. And that worked on Gorbachev as much as it did on Reagan. I'm sure you have in your book, how they were observing the worldwide nuclear movement that was going on in the Kremlin.
Well, actually, I think that's really what was on my mind at the time when I contrasted the the American government's position to that of the Soviets' position, in that officially and ostensibly the US government, or at least the administration, ignored or discounted the importance of any demonstrations. They didn't. Whereas I was having my way paid by the Soviet government to meetings in Moscow, where I would meet with the highest level people. I remember the editor of Pravda or the head of this or that, all very, very high level ranking people. And they would listen to me as if I were, an emissary of God. They just paid attention. And I thought, this just would not happen in the US and even in Canada. And I'm a dual citizen, so I was working both sides of the street. Mm-hmm. And, nothing like that symbolically happened. But seriously, I was invited along with huge numbers of other people to participate in street demonstrations and so on. I remember the first trip, I think, was to Prague. And it must have been, in that case, it was probably paid for by the Czechoslovak then government. And I swear there must have been 1,000 or 10,000 foreigners, because we filled the whole streets and they gave us presents. I still have little, artwork done by children that they gave me and things like that from that trip. And it was must have cost, a huge amount to bring people. That was just to Prague, and then some other things in Moscow. Frequent trips to have dialogues with high-ranking Soviet officials in Russia. And the thing that impressed me, because here in Toronto, I'd come home to people who would say, now, I hope you were polite and you didn't raise any troublesome issues, and you mustn't have, sounded too confrontational or ask them about their nuclear weapons or anything that would embarrass them, because we're trying to make peace, which means that you don't talk about anything troublesome. Mm-hmm. Well, what actually happened there was that I would sit at this table and I would say very politely, it would really help probably the negotiations about nuclear weapons if there were not this issue about human rights in Russia, because I was actually going to see some of the dissidents in my spare time in Moscow and so on. And they would give me their canned response to, human rights is not relevant or whatever. But then we'd have a coffee break and we'd go off and individually talk. And they would come to me and they said, that's it. That's just what we want you to say. Keep going. That's just right. Or they would almost wink at me. It wasn't really a wink, but it'd be a sort of a softening of the eyes, kind of indicate, yeah, we like what you're doing. And if I forget on some of these occasions, if I'd forget to bring it up, they would even privately come to me and say, look, you were doing great before. Why don't you talk about that again? Say that you want us to become more democratic. Say that you want us to become more concerned about human rights and freedom, etc. Keep doing that because that's what we need. They tell me, Flint, same people who, and then we go back to the table and then they would do their routine number. So it was really quite an eye opener. And that was, in a way, what was the basis of my book, the recognition that way before Gorbachev came to power, this was even, I think, before Andropov. I believe it was still in Brezhnev, although I can't remember exactly for sure. But it was way before Gorbachev came to power. There were all kinds of indications that within the party, the leaders and some very important leaders, for example, Georgy Arbatov, who was the head of the USA-Canada Institute, he was completely eager for us to talk about making changes in the Soviet Union and democratizing it and paying attention to human rights and so on. So that is really what made me feel, wow, we had a whole lot more influence there than we did anywhere near Washington.
Yeah. But again, even in the US, I would argue that the cumulative effort of all of the different protests and actions changed the political climate. And across the US, there was a growing fear of nuclear weapons and a determination to demand that our political leaders do something about the nuclear danger, reduce the nuclear weapons, and try to come to an accommodation with the Soviet Union. And that's the way it is so often in peace movements. You go back to the Vietnam movement and then the Iraq anti-war movement. I'm writing a book about that now as well. And if you look at the specifics, it sometimes appears disappointing. You don't get the specific demands that you want. We weren't able to stop the invasion of Iraq. We didn't get Reagan to cut back the nuclear weapons in the way that we wanted. But eventually, in the case of the arms race, the two sides were able to negotiate. And we did see the reductions that we had been demanding. I can tell you a story. It's interesting how even those of us who are out in the streets demanding change sometimes don't recognize the influence that we have and the way in which our ideas sometimes do prevail. So in '87, I think it was, they negotiated the INF agreement, the treaty to eliminate all of these intermediate range nuclear forces in Europe. And I was invited to come to Germany by the Green Party, which was it was early in the days of the Green Party. And they were having a conference and they were trying to figure out what this INF treaty meant and how to deal with it because it was confusing to them. And initially they were kind of depressed because it seemed to them that the Europeans had lost the debate in '83 and '84 when NATO went ahead and started to deploy the weapons. And yeah, that's what it looked like. But the idea of a zero option of reducing and eliminating all of these weapons from both the Soviet Union and the NATO side continued. And it was at the bargaining table. And then Gorbachev, as I mentioned, took the idea and presented it to Reagan at the negotiating table. And lo and behold, they agreed to that as the terms for the treaty. So when I got to the Green Party meeting, everybody was sort of gloomy. And
wait, this was your meeting was after the INF treaty had been
negotiated.
Started.
Yeah. They had just finished the negotiation, and I guess it was already beginning to take effect. And so when it came my turn speak, and I said, we really shouldn't be seeing this as a setback or as a problem. This was because of what we did. The ideas that were put into this agreement came from the peace movement, not from the arms negotiators. And both on the US side and on the Soviet side, our ideas got on the agenda, and eventually they signed an agreement to do exactly what we had demanded. And it never happens in the way you might expect, and you can't always tell whether you're having an impact. And by the way, it's really important to understand that all political leaders deny that they are being pressured by rabble in the streets, or as Bush said, I'm not going to be influenced by a focus group. But the truth is that they are very worried about all of the people in the streets, and they pay attention, and they spend a lot of money and effort to try to persuade us otherwise, and to propagandize the public about what's in the policy. They lie, in other words. But people's involvement of negotiation, pressing for negotiation, and demanding an end to war, an end to the arms race, that can have an impact, and it always helps to shape the political climate, and eventually it has a cumulative impact. That was certainly true, in the Vietnam anti-war movement, which went on for 10 years. It was very depressing. The killing in Vietnam seemed to be relentless, and it couldn't be stopped. But at many steps along the way, the anti-war movements exerted enough pressure to influence the course of the war and forced the United States to have to pull out, and then eventually led to the Vietnamese victory. So, you never know when you're having impact. It's always too early to say you failed, and you need to stay involved in the activism and have faith that we will prevail and will have influence. And in any case, not to protest, I would say, is to give in to the other side, is to accept all the lies and all the violence and the suffering and the killing that comes from these policies. So I think we have an obligation to have faith in the power of people, in the ability of ideas and words eventually to have influence, to shape the debate. So now what I try to do in my research is to identify through a careful reading of the history of these events how we do have that influence and how you can trace it to specific activities and events.
So this wasn't just your thrust in that one book. You've continued making the same point in other contexts about the Iraq War and so on.
Yeah, and the Vietnam War.
It would be harder, I think, even harder, let's say, to make one about the Iraq War. Did you feel, I don't know, how do you argue that case, that the protests against the Iraq War had any influence?
Yeah, well, we did not stop the invasion, but it's interesting if you look that, Bush was reelected and so was Blair, but in every other country where there was a leader as the French prime minister at the time, can't remember, the Spanish prime minister at the time, who was unceremoniously dumped by the electorate a year later, and other politicians who had supported the war paid a price in their countries. And keep in mind that the UN refused the demand of Bush and Blair that they authorized the use of force. So they had to go to war without any real support. I mean, they talked about a coalition of the willing, but if you look at what actually happened on the ground in Iraq, other countries sent, 100 troops, 500 troops, small numbers, but they did not engage in combat. And the US had to bear the burden of the war. More than 95% of the casualties came from the US, and then also the UK suffered some casualties, and Poland a little bit. But so the US had to bear the brunt of that war, and the opposition in the US steadily mounted. And it ended up moving into politics. So there was a very strong push, mostly from within the Democratic Party, to campaign on an anti-war position, on a position of ending the war in Iraq. And in '06, the Democrats won the Congress and elected a number of congressional leaders who were supporting legislation to have a timetable for US withdrawal. And that whole idea of a timetable for withdrawal came from the anti-war movement, from the protests in the streets, and from not so much protests in the street, but electoral and political mobilization in the '06 elections. And then that carried over to this junior senator from Illinois, Obama, who entered the primaries, primarily on the basis of his position against the war. Now, Obama was hardly a peace candidate, and he had a lot of limitations on his policies, but he did say that he would end the war in Iraq, and that was his principal distinction between himself and Senator Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton, and that was what put him over the edge in terms of the election in the Democratic Party, and then also helped him get elected in the general vote. And again, his way of ending the war was not what we wanted. We wanted an immediate pullout of American troops that took the better part of 3 years, but we did get American troops out. And at the end of the day, who benefited from the Iraq war? The Iranians. And everything that the US attempted or thought or claimed that it was for, like democracy and stability and, and all of the WMD, all of that turned out to be a lie or fabrication, an illusion. And again, the protests, the setting of the agenda that came from people in the streets and from then a political process to mobilize in US Congress and in the elections helped to shape American policy. And as I said, it put the idea of a timetable for withdrawal on the political agenda. That idea, by the way, it passed in the US Congress, in both the Senate and the House in '07. Now, Bush vetoed it. He had to use a veto to stop it. And in the US electoral system, you had to get 60 votes in the Senate to override a veto, or no, 67, like it's 2/3. So that was not possible. But nonetheless, you did have Congress establish the position that a timetable for withdrawal was to be American policy.
Okay, that's worth remembering because, of course, that applies in Afghanistan as part of the period of that.
Yeah, same thing there. People are fed up. Even the veterans and the people who were in the military who were part of the war were increasingly opposed to it. And again, that happened in Vietnam. I was part of that whole movement. Those of us who were in the military during the Vietnam War, many of us began to speak out. And the veterans demonstrated.
What happened when you did that? I mean, what is the discipline on soldiers who get mouthy about not liking what they're asked to do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was not in Vietnam. I was stationed in the US, in the States, from '68 to '71. But I knew, and everyone who's in the Army knows, that if you speak out against the war, or if you start to talk back to the commanders on issues of policy, you're going to get in trouble. But at that point, I felt so strongly that the war was immoral. I didn't care what they did to me. I had to speak out against this war. And for me, it was pretty minor stuff, actually. There was a punitive discharge. They sent me to another base. They changed my duty assignments so that we did nothing but, make work details and the like. I didn't suffer seriously. Many others were imprisoned, or they were given court martials or non-judicial punishment, as it's called, where you get reduced in rank and your pay gets reduced. But there were many thousands of us, hundreds of thousands really in total, who resisted the war in the military. And cumulatively, again, if you think of the whole picture, it became a point where the military was falling apart from within. If you look at the disciplinary figures, the desertions that were going on, and in Vietnam, there were combat refusals. There were attacks by men in the military against their own officers and commanders. So the whole army was starting to break down by 69, 70, 71. And at the same time, tremendous pressure was being applied in Washington on the political establishment to end the war. Remember that Nixon campaigned in 68 as a, quote, peace candidate. He said he had a secret peace plan. But he did end the military draft. And when they ended the military draft, that really spelled the end of the prospect for any US military success in Vietnam, because they weren't going to get the troops, and they did not. And the size of the military rapidly declined. So a whole number of complex factors that led to the ending of the war and the US inability to achieve its objectives in Vietnam. And the peace movement kept up a steady drumbeat, kept the peace issue on the agenda for 10 years, and eventually we forced an end to the war. So,
well, and then you made a big transition, because from being a peace organizer and rabble rouser within the military, you become a dignified professor at a Catholic university. How did that happen? And what were the strains involved in making such a transition?
Yeah. Well, I always viewed myself as, yes, an activist, but also as a scholar. I had gotten my PhD. My first book on the history of the soldiers' anti-war movement was my PhD dissertation. So, and I always, when I was the director of SANE, I introduced the idea that we should have footnotes in our pamphlets, and verify our claims and all the rest. And but after I had been doing all of that for nearly 20 years, I did want to look at options for going to a university. And I graduated from Notre Dame as an undergraduate, a good Catholic kid back in 68. And I followed what was going on, and I learned that they had set up a Peace Studies Institute. And I was quite intrigued, because Notre Dame is a Catholic university, and it's a pretty conservative place. And I thought it was very promising that a Peace Studies Center would be set up in Notre Dame. So I went to check it out, and I really liked what I saw. And I applied to be a visiting fellow. And I was their first visiting fellow, I think it was in '89. And over the years, through the leadership of Father Theodore Hesburgh, Father Ted Hesburgh, a great peace educator, a great civil rights champion, and an opponent of nuclear weapons, he always said that you cannot have a great university if you don't also have a great program for peace. And we should have.
Was he the president of the university?
He was the university president, yes, exactly. For many years, from 53, I believe, till like in the mid 80s, the latter part of the 80s. And he went ahead and set up a Peace Studies Center. He also set up a center on civil and human rights as sort of his legacy as he retired from the presidency, but he wanted to have these institutes. And same logic for each, that there should be at a great university the study of human and civil rights and the study of peace. And it's grown into a tremendous program. It's one of the, as you said in your intro remarks, it's one of the largest in the world. And it's called the Kroc Institute because he became good friends with Mrs. Joan B. Kroc, the widow of Ray Kroc. And Ray had been the business person who created the McDonald's restaurant chain and this fabulous fortune that came from it. And when Ray passed away, his estate passed on to Joan, and she was a supporter of peace. And so when Father Ted told her about this idea of a Peace Studies Center, she said, well, how can I help?
Pretty easy.
Father Ted had the right answer. And so she began to donate and eventually created a very substantial endowment. So we've been able to use that support to develop a very strong academic program. So we have an undergraduate Peace Studies major and a concentration. And each year we have a couple of hundred undergraduate students taking Peace Studies classes. And then we have a master's program in Peace Studies. Now that's been merged with a master's in global affairs. at the university, because we now have a School of Global Affairs.
Okay.
But so now each year we're bringing in 35 or 40 master's degree students from around the world. 2/3 of those students are international. They come from zones of conflict, and more than half of them are concentrated in peace studies. So we're every year turning out dozens of master's students who we hope are going back into zones of conflict around the world, having learned the principles of peace building and of negotiation and of human rights and development and all of the dimensions that are necessary for peacemaking.
Well,
And then on top
does
of,
everybody take the same array of particular trainings? In other words, are there people who specialize, let's say, in conflict resolution, mediation, et cetera, where
Yeah.
other people talk maybe about influencing government economic policies or something like that?
Yeah.
How much differentiation is there within the program as to subspecialties?
Yeah, our master's program has a lot of required courses, so there's, a master's student would take 15 to 17 courses during their 2-year degree program. And 6 or 7 of those or more are requirements. So they have to learn strategic peace building. They also have to learn the economics and the politics of development policy, and a number of other, I'm not exactly clear what are the required courses right now, but definitely the principles of strategic peace building, of conflict resolution, of nonviolence are part of the core requirements for each of the students. And then they're able to branch out into one or another field. So we have a concentration in mediation, or a program in mediation. We have a lot of strengths in human rights. Now we have a program on gender and peace building, so that gets a lot of attention. And we have just in the last couple of years, developing a program on environmental issues and peace building and the climate crisis. And so students are able to develop some specialization as well for whatever career path they may be interested in.
Do you have any more courses on how to set up an organization like SANE?
Well, I actually teach a course. It's very germane to the title of your program here. My course is entitled "How to Change the World," and what I do, you mentioned how do I bring this into harmony with my activist life. Well, I basically try to teach the students what I've learned through a career in activism. As I say to them, I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, so I can share some of them with you and help you to avoid them and to also see what works. But I really do try to teach, some of the basic principles of nonviolence, what Gandhi and King and others had to say, and why that's essential foundation for any effective social change. And then what strategy is about, why it's important to have sound strategy, following the work of Gene Sharp, and now the more recent work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, yes. But then we talk about cases, so I talk a little bit about the Vietnam anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. But lately we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and the global climate change movement with groups like Sunrise Movement and also the Occupy movement from a few years ago. So I always ask the students, what movements are of interest to you? What are you concerned about? And so let's study that in this class and use it as a laboratory to think about what are the most effective ways to address the climate crisis or to address issues of racial justice. So we really do try to create change agents. And that's the whole ethos of our School of Global Affairs as well. As you mentioned, I've been asked to help set up this global policy initiative at the School of Global Affairs here. And that means to help the faculty orient their research towards real life policy issues like climate change, or like most recently, just now in the last month or so, what is the meaning of the US defeat in Afghanistan and of the collapse of this whole 20-year war in Afghanistan? And
Meaning,
what,
or what are the lessons to be learned from
well,
it?
that's what I mean by that. Yes,
Yeah.
that there are specific lessons, and how can we as faculty and students look at this debacle, this disaster, and learn how to avoid such mistakes in the future. So we try to really orient our scholarship to practical issues of peace and development and human rights, and now, of course, also climate crisis in our, to bring it into the classroom and into our research.
Well, my concern is that we're not making a whole lot of progress on weapons and war, anti-war activities now. I think partly because our attention has to be divided among a number of other issues,
So true.
obviously COVID and obviously also climate. And somehow it seems to me, if we can show the interaction and the linkage and the interdependence among these issues, so that it becomes a more of a unified campaign with a comprehensive program for change, I would hope that, well, that would look something like a Green New Deal, except that the Green New Deal, at least in the US, does not include any opposition to militarism. They go ahead and fund every gun that anybody wants.
Yeah.
But I would hope that strategically that we could somehow find a way of merging these concerns, because they're all top priority. You can't say one is, you can do one and forget the others or postpone the others.
I agree completely. And I have been reading a lot of Andrew Bacevich. Perhaps you know the author, the former military. He's actually was a 20-year military guy, and his son was killed in Iraq. But he's a strong opponent of militarism, and has been writing constantly that, you know, military power cannot address these problems, and that we need to pull back from this aggressive imperial foreign policy that the United States has been pursuing. And he's talked recently about the need for a fundamental new, different paradigm for the US role in the world, away from being a military policeman of the world, and to orient our policy towards cooperation with others, and to address these other very real threats to our security and to world security. Just as you say, the pandemic, the climate crisis, the problems of, you know, weaponized disinformation campaigns, how to address the challenge of the rise of China in the global order. These are gigantic issues which are going to affect our future much more than these issues around Afghanistan and Iraq and the like. And we're still in the US piling more and more money into the Pentagon budget. I mean, Biden actually increased the budget over what Trump had proposed. And then members of Congress have just added more money to the legislation that's now being debated in the Congress. And it's like complete insanity when we need to be putting those resources to work to address our environmental and health and other needs in the US and globally. So the only way to do that, I agree completely, is to show the links, so that the people who are concerned about the pandemic and global health have to recognize that one of the reasons why we've had such difficulty meeting this challenge is because of the inadequate cooperation among states, and also the fact that the resources need to be devoted to developing the vaccines and then producing them and distributing them worldwide are used instead for weapons. When we,
I must say, I'm just in the last month, I've become more disillusioned with Biden, because it looked to me like I had some hope that he was going to turn a corner, but it doesn't look that way. And this new deal with Australia about nuclear powered subs is, and the kerfuffle that it engendered with France, is cause for, if not alarm, at least concern.
Yeah. And they're all responding to these issues in a completely misguided way. The fundamental problems are never addressed. Why do we even need nuclear powered submarines of any kind? And the whole idea that you want to build up a military alliance against China in East Asia and that Australia and these other countries are going to come to the defense of the US in some kind of military confrontation with China is extremely dangerous and counterproductive, and that's what's adding the fuel to the fire of excessive military spending in the United States right now. The additional money that members of Congress just added to the budget proposal is to build more ships. This insane idea that the United States is going to send all these fleets over to the West Pacific, and we are doing this, and that somehow this is going to intimidate China and somehow force it to cry uncle. It's kind of the same insane madness that we saw with the Soviet Union during the worst days of the Cold War, except for this is extreme. I'd say it's even more dangerous because the effect that it has on China is to only, it seems to me, facilitate or encourage the militarists on their side. And you've seen that China has been building up its military as well. It's by no means a threat to the US or the West right now. But the more we confront them and send our fleets over to their shores, well, naturally, they're going to respond in kind. And China does not need any more encouragement to be moving towards authoritarianism and militarism. And we ought to be trying to cooperate with them and figure out ways in which we can work together on. We can't solve the global climate crisis without cooperating with China. And on the pandemic, the same way. We keep blaming them for the pandemic when we should try to work with them on, again, accelerating the process of making vaccines available to people around the world. And the fact that China is building its influence, it's so interesting that we send aircraft carriers and military forces to countries. China sends investors and builds railroads and ports and highways. And yeah, they grab a chunk of the resources for themselves and they get ownership of the stuff that they build. But why can't the US and other countries compete in that way? Let's outdo one another in providing investments and support for countries to develop and to improve their economic well-being. Now, we think we need a different model of development, but that should be the basis for how we compete.
I noticed looking at your CV, or not your CV, but the website of the Kroc Institute, that one of the things you do a lot is work on sanctions, the impact of multilateral sanctions.
Yeah.
And I'd like one of these days to have a whole talk show about that with you and maybe 2 or 3 other people who have alternative points of view. And I don't know what your point of view is, because speak a little bit about that before we wind up.
Yeah, well, I cooperated with my colleague here, George Lopez, on a number of books and research projects on sanctions. And our view was always that sanctions can be effective as a tool of bargaining and diplomacy. But to use them for coercive means, A, it never works, and B, it has severe humanitarian impacts. And it's especially those humanitarian hardships that are the greatest cause for concern. And we're right now in the midst of some major studies that we're going to be releasing probably early next year on documenting in detail the severe hardships that are resulting from sanctions against Venezuela, against Iran, and Syria. And now we see the US sanctions that have been imposed on the new Taliban interim government in Afghanistan that are going to have the similar, very severe humanitarian impacts. So we don't like who these leaders are in the Taliban. And what do? We punish the people of Afghanistan. 35 million or more people right now are having severe difficulties getting access to any kind of funds, any kind of Western currencies, hard currencies. And it's going to be already starting to create humanitarian hardships. So it's a complete misuse of sanctions. Again, from our perspective, it's always been the case that they should be used as bargaining instruments to try to encourage diplomacy. And it was actually quite effectively done in Iran. The Iran nuclear deal, if you look at the process, how it unfolded, it was when the Europeans and then the US said, well, we will lift the sanctions if you'll agree to more rigorous inspections and verification of that there'll be no nuclear weapons development in Iran. And it worked. And the deal was signed, and the very rigorous inspections came in, and Iran was fully complying with the agreement, and the sanctions were lifted by the Europeans and by the US.
Okay, but the people who argue in favor of sanctions generally give some lip service to the notion that you don't want to impose sanctions that hurt the people, but you want to find targeted sanctions. You want to target evildoers, but in a way that would not have impact on the general population. Exactly. I don't know whether that in practice is something that can normally be done, although there are things like the Magnitsky laws, which aim specifically to exclude people from travel and from ownership of property and stuff if they have clearly been party to some sort of human rights abuse. I don't know the terms under these Magnitsky rules, but that one makes sense to me. Sure. I don't know whether it makes sense to you, but what else could you do that would be more adhere to the general principle that you want to hurt the people who should be hurt and not the people who shouldn't?
Yeah, well, Lopez and I, that was the focus of our research, was the targeted sanctions. And the idea is you would impose a freeze on financial assets and on travel, and embargoes on weapons and arms and military-related technologies on very specific individuals or specific firms. But instead, what's really happened is that the U.S. is imposing these secondary sanctions that cut off banking systems and shut down financial mechanisms for trade. So that's what's affected Iran and Venezuela and Syria lately, and that's what's now underway in Afghanistan. So because we locked down all the funds, it's like a general trade embargo. And the US says, well, we have exemptions. But what good is an exemption if you can't buy anything, if you can't access the financing to be able to buy the basic supplies that are necessary? And this is the so-called maximum pressure idea that Trump introduced. But really, it goes back to Democratic administrations as well. The US has been imposing these secondary or extraterritorial sanctions, which essentially say to other countries and other firms, if you trade with Afghanistan, well, you can't trade in the US. You're not allowed to do business in the US, which cuts off people from a big chunk of international trade because the dollar is still the currency of transaction for oil and a lot of other things. So we're misusing the power of the dollar to impose what are effectively general trade sanctions that cut off access to financing for entire populations. And that always affects the poor, working families, the innocent, much more than those who are actually responsible for the policies.
Okay, I want to come back to this another time.
Sure.
If you're willing to, I'll set up a deal where we have a conversation specifically about multilateral sanctions. We have never had one on that. So, and I noticed that one of the things that the Rideau Institute in Ottawa is doing now is they've issued a report about the effect of sanctions. So maybe we can get somebody from who was involved in that project to have a conversation. That'd be good. Okay. This has been fun, and it's high time, Okay. 30, 40 years later, we get back together. That was a good lunch with you. I appreciate it.
Okay. All right, thank you so much.